Hi everyone, I'm Curt Frye, and in my previous movie, I showed you how to perform cluster analysis in Microsoft Excel. In this movie, I want to show you how to build the workbook that we used previously. The sample file we're using, Cluster Workbook, can be downloaded using the link in the video description below. And this is a mostly blank workbook. The only thing I didn't want to make you do was to type in the starting points for our customer data, which we'll be trying to cluster. The table that I've started here on the left is a list of positions for items that we want to cluster. In column A, we have the values on the x-axis. So in A2, I'll type x_axis, and this will be a table column label. And then in column B, I have the y-axis, so y_axis and tab. We are using the centroid method for identifying clusters, and in this case I want to have 3 clusters, so we need 3 centroids, and we calculate the distance from each of the points in the x and y axis to each centroid and look for the smallest. So we will calculate the distance to centroid 1, so dist_c1, and then I'll click cell C2 and drag the fill handle to the right. And because the last character in the cell value is a number, if you click it and drag the fill handle to the right, then Excel will extend the sequence. So we got distance to C2 and distance to C3. And finally, we need a record of the centroid that will be assigned to each of the points. So that header will be centroid. So my formulas are easier to understand. I will turn this into an Excel table. So click a cell that contains data, and then on the Home tab, click Format as Table. Click a table style, doesn't matter which one, and then the range has been identified correctly, and it does have headers, so I'll click OK. There we go. And I will double-click the right edge of the columns to make sure that I can see all of the text in the label. One final thing I'll do is to rename the table. So on the Table Design Contextual tab, in the table name box, I will type main table. All right, that looks good. The next step is to create a table that has the positions of our centroids. So in cell H2, I will type C_number. That will be the number of the centroid. Then press tab, and in I2, I'll type C_x-axis, and then in J2, C_y_axis. Centroid numbers will be 1 through 3, and I can just type those in quickly, and I'll also make this a table. So I'll click a cell that contains a label, or actually any data, format as table, click a style, click OK, and double-click the right edge to widen out each of the columns, and I will name this table centroids. And enter. There we go. I also want to record the maximum values for the customers on the y-axis and the x-axis. So in L2, I'll type max, M-A-X, x_axis, and in M2, max, y_axis. I won't make this a table, but I do want to make them bold so that they are identified as labels. That looks good. And now I can create a formula to identify the largest of the values. So in L3, I'll type equal max, and then after the left parentheses, I'll go over to the main table, and I will select column A, which is the x-axis column. So I've moved my mouse pointer over the column label, and when it changes to a downward pointing black arrow, I can click to select, and you see the reference has been updated in the formula. Then a right parentheses and tab, and I get the maximum value of 25, which is correct. We'll do the same thing for the y-axis, so equal max, select the y-axis column, right parentheses, enter, and there we go. With those values in place, we can create our first set of random centroids. So I'll click in cell I3, and we want to generate a value between 0, inclusive, and the maximum for the x-axis and for the y-axis for each of the 3 centroids we'll be creating at random. So in I3, I'll type equal, ran between 0, comma, and the top value, because this is the x-axis, will be the value in L3. I don't want that reference changing when the formula is copied down, so I'll press F4 to make the L3 reference absolute, right parentheses and enter, and we got our random values. And we'll do the same thing for the y-axis, just pointing to M3. So ran between 0, comma, M3, pressing the F4 key to make the reference absolute, right parentheses, enter, and there we go. I don't want the ran between formulas to recalculate every time the workbook recalculates, so I will select cells I3 through J5, Control-C to copy, Control-Shift-V to paste values, and we have our random starting centroids. Now that we have the position of our centroids, and of course we have our customer positions here over in the main table, we can calculate the distance. There are a number of ways that you can calculate distance, but we are going to use what's called the Euclidean distance. You probably remember the Pythagorean theorem, where the two sides of a triangle tell you the length of the hypotenuse. That equation is a squared plus b squared equals c squared, where the length of the hypotenuse is the square root of c squared. So the following formulas should look a little familiar. I'll click in cell C3, and we can calculate the distance for the point designated by row 3, x-axis and y-axis 5 and 3, to the first of the centroids, which is in I3 and J3. So in C3, I'll type equal, and we'll take the square root of the following expression. I need to type another left parentheses because we're going to do subtraction followed by raising to a power. That will be A3 minus I3. I don't want I3 to change in this column, so I'll press F4, then a right parentheses, and I need to square that value to get my A squared. So that will be a caret and a 2. Then plus the same thing for the y-axis values. So another left parentheses, and that is B3 minus J3. And again, J3 shouldn't change, so I'll press F4 to make it absolute. Right parentheses, caret and a 2 to square it, and then right parentheses and enter, and there are the distances. Now we'll do the same thing for centroid 2 and centroid 3, and I can use most of the same formula. So I will click cell C3, and then on the formula bar, I will select and press Control-C to copy, then escape. Then I will double-click cell D3 to open it for editing, Control-V. And now I need to update the references for centroid number 2. And the X value is in I4. You can see it highlighted in red. And then J4 is the Y-axis. Enter. There are those distances. And now the same thing for centroid 3. So I'll double-click cell E3, Control-V, because the text I copied earlier is still on the clipboard. And then I'll make it I5, which is for centroid 3, and J5, and enter. And there we go. With those distances in place, we can now identify the centroid assigned to each of our points by finding the minimum of the values in C3 to E3. So I'll click in cell F3, and I need to make 2 comparisons. I need to see if distance to centroid 1 is smallest. If it is, assign the number 1. If not, check if the distance to C2 is the smallest. If it is, assign 2. If not, assign 3, because we only need 2 if statements, because we can do true or false on either of them. So let's see how that works in practice. In F3, I'll type equal, if, and the logical test value will be if C3 equals the minimum value from the range C3 colon E3. If it is, we assign the number 1, and if not, then we do a second if test. So that will be if, left parentheses, D3 equals the minimum of C3 to E3, right parentheses, comma, 2. If that's true, we'll assign centroid 2 because it's closest. If not, after a comma, centroid 3. Right parentheses to close out the nested if statement, and then a right parentheses to close out the entire formula. Enter. And we have a lot of centroids 2 and a lot 3, and nothing has been assigned to centroid number 1. In a case like this, and I'm glad I came up with the random values I created, it can make sense to change the position of one of the centroids. So I'll go over to I3, and I'll type 7, and that changed some of these centroid assignments. That's good. And that is one of the weaknesses of this method. If you don't have any points assigned to a given centroid at the start, it's possible that you won't have any at the end either. So it's best to make sure that at least one is assigned when you begin. The next step in our process calls for us to update the positions of our centroids, but it's easier to visualize what's happening if I chart the positions of our customer data here on the left and the centroids in an XY scatter plot. So let's do that now. I'll start by selecting the x-axis and y-axis columns. That will give me the customer data. Then I'll go to the Insert tab, and then click the Scatter button, click the down arrow, and I have a chart with the positions for all of the customer data. And I'll just update the chart title to cluster. There we go. Need to select the text, cluster analysis. Okay, and then I will click away, but still on the chart because I want to add the centroids as well. And to do that, on the Chart Design Contextual tab, which only appears when a chart is selected, click Select Data. Then in the Legend, Entries, and Series panel, click Add. The series name we won't worry about. The series X values are in I3 to I5, and the series Y values are in J3 to J5. So I'll click OK, click OK again, and we have 3 centroids, and those are in orange, and we also have our original points in blue. The next step is to move a centroid to the middle of all of the points to which it has been assigned. So here, this point will move slightly up, most likely. This point, this centroid, will move to the middle of the group here, and this centroid will move to the middle of this group. To do those calculations, we need to find the average position of each of these centroids, and to do that, we can find the average X value and Y value of all of the points assigned to centroid number 1. So let's go ahead and create those formulas. I'll click in cell L5 and create a label that I'll call centroid updates, and click that cell and make it bold because I'm using it as a label. Then in K6, I'll type a 1, below that a 2, below that a 3. And then in L6, I want to create a formula that will find the average X value of every point assigned to centroid number 1. So for that, I will use the average if function. And the range is the main table centroid. Then a comma, And the value that we're looking at will be in K6 because that's the centroid number. Then a comma, and the average range will be the x positions. So that is the x-axis column from the main table. Then a right parentheses and enter, and I get an average of 3. And if I copy that down, I get 3, 12, and 23. Now we can do the same thing starting in M6 for the y-axis. So that'll be equal average if. The range, again, will be the centroid, then a comma. The criteria will be the value in K6, then a comma. And the average range will be the values in the y-axis column. Follow that with a right parentheses and enter, get 3.4. Copy down, and those are our values. So with those calculations in place, I want to replace the values in the centroid table that we started with randomly with the updated values. So I will select cells L6 through M8, Control C, click cell I3, then Control Shift V to paste in the values only, and we have our updated values here. Also note that the centroid calculation is updated, and I can see that we're done and have a good solution because the centroid update calculations are the same as the centroids that we have in the centroid table. So that means that according to our calculations, we have found a valid solution. So this solution works, but the problem is that we are cutting and pasting manually. So we have the centroid updates here that we calculate, copy, and paste over. And it would be much easier to generate a random set of centroids to start and to update the centroids using macros. So all we need to do is run the macro or click a button to run it. So let's see how to do that. You want to be sure that you have all of your steps in mind and planned out before you start recording your macro, because unless you are very good at editing VBA code, you will have to start over so that the macro you record is exactly what you want. So let's start recording. I'll go up to the View tab, then click the Macros buttons down arrow over on the right, and I'll click View Macros to make sure I don't have anything currently in. Good. Then Macros and Record Macro. The macro name will be Generate Centroids. Click OK, and Excel is now recording. To generate the centroids at random, I need to create the formulas that I did before. So I'll select I3 through I5 equal rand between 0, then a comma, and the value in L3, which is the maximum for the x-axis, then F4, right parentheses, and to enter the formula into all the selected cells, I'll press Control Enter. There we go. And I'll do the same thing for the y-axis. So I'll select J3 through J5 equal rand between, bottom is 0, then a comma, and the top value is in M3, F4 to make it absolute, right parentheses, and Control Enter. And there we have our random centroids. Now I will select I3 through J5 because, again, we want the values to remain the same and not have the formulas recalculated every time the worksheet's recalculated. So I'll type Control C to select, Control Shift V to paste in the values. Then I will click away to a blank cell, press Escape to get out of cut copy mode, and now we can stop recording. So I'll go up to the macros box, click its down arrow, click Stop Recording, and get rid of the task pane over on the right, and there we go. Now as a test, let's rerun the macro that we just recorded. So I'll go up to the macros dialog box, click View Macros, I have generate centroids, so I'll click run, and we get random values with a divide by zero error. And that does happen with this method, but that just means that we can generate a new set, and here we have our random values. So we have done well at creating random centroids, and now we can do the same for creating a macro for the centroid update. So I'll go back up to the macros button, click its down arrow, click record macro, and for the macro I will call it update centroids, and OK. And once again, our goal is to copy the values from L6 to M8 and paste them in our centroid table. So I will select L6 to M8, copy, then select I3 through J5, Control-Shift-V to paste the values, and then I'll click a blank cell, press escape to get out of cut copy mode, and we're done. So I will stop recording. So go to macros, stop recording, close the helpful task pane, and there we are. Now let's go up and run the macro, make sure it works properly. So I'll click the macros button, view macros, update centroids, and run. And we have the solution that we found earlier, and we can tell it's good because the centroid update values are the same as the values in our centroid table. Of course, going back to the macros dialog box can be a pain. It would be easier if we could assign a macro to a button that we could click. And we can do that by creating a shape and assigning the macro to it. To do that, I will go to the Insert tab of the ribbon, click Shapes, and I'll make these a rounded rectangle. So I'll click Rounded Rectangle, and then drag over here, and I can just start typing. I will do generate centroids, and I'll make the shape a bit wider. There we go. Then I'll go to the Home tab, and I will center the text within the shape. I'll create a second shape to update the centroids. So I will, with the shape selected, press Ctrl-D. That duplicates the shape, and I'll scroll down. And for this one, I will change its fill color to orange. There we go. And for this, rather than generate centroids, it will be update centroids. There we go. To assign a macro to a shape, right-click it, and then click Assign Macro. The Assign Macro dialog box appears, and I'll click Generate Centroids. Click OK, and then I'll do the same thing for Update Centroids. So right-click that, Assign Macro, Update, and OK. So I have just assigned macros to each of these buttons, and let's click them to make sure they work. So I'll click Generate Centroids, and actually when I move the mouse pointer over, you can see that it changes from a white cross to a blue pointing hand. So I'll click there, and we have our random values. Then I'll click Update. The positions have been updated. Click again, and those are the values we were looking for. Do it one more time with Generate until I no longer get a divide by zero error. So I generate centroids, update, update, and update, and it looks like we have once again reached our valid solution. We have walked through the process of the calculations to perform cluster analysis using the centroid method, and also automated it using macros in Excel. So now, when you work in Python or R and perform a cluster analysis, you will know what's going on behind the scenes. Thanks again for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it, and if you did, please like it and subscribe to my channel.